When we were young, we still had hope for America. We thought that if we worked as hard as our parents, we would have about the same living standards. We used to think that we were going to be able to own a home or maybe get a college degree or buy a new car and also afford everyday expenses just as our parents and grandparents did back in the day. But living conditions have sharply deteriorated since then. The cost of virtually everything has skyrocketed to unprecedented levels, but our salaries have not. Things have gotten dramatically worse in the United States since we were kids, and now we're the ones having to cope with a broken economy that makes millions of families struggle to make ends meet every month. What in the world has happened to our country? Most of us still have very fond memories from when we were younger. The good old days that seem so far away by now. But those times are not coming back. Our problems keep growing bigger and bigger, and the more time passes by, the fewer Americans can afford to live in this country. That's why today, we have decided to compile some shocking numbers, comparing how life used to be a few decades ago to what we are living today. But before checking this list, please don't forget to leave a thumbs up and please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our upcoming lists. Without further ado, here are 20 examples that show that America is far more messed up than when you were a kid. Number 1. Americans who were born in 1970 have seen their purchasing power decline by a shocking 653.34% over the past 52 years. $1 in 1970 would be equivalent to about $7.53 today. This means that today's prices are 7.53 times higher than average prices since 1970. The dollar had an average inflation rate of 3.96% per year between 1970 and today. However, a dollar today only buys 13.28% of what it could buy back then. 2. For adults who were born in the 80s, they've seen the dollar decreasing to 154.73% in value over the past 42 years. $1 in 1980 would be equivalent in purchasing power to about $3.55 today. That means that today's prices are 3.55 times higher than average prices since 1980. And that's according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index. A dollar today only buys 28.169% of what it could buy back then. 3. Over the past 32 years, the dollar's buying power collapsed by 123.64%. In other words, in 1990, $1 would be equivalent to around $2.24 today. Right now, $1 only buys 44.643% of what it could buy back in the early 90s. 4. Meanwhile, housing prices have risen much faster than wages over the past 5 decades. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, prices for housing are 707.68% higher in 2022 versus 1970. From that point on, housing has experienced an average inflation rate of 4.10% per year. Simply put, housing costing $100,000 in the year 1970 would cost $807,676 in 2022 for an equivalent purchase. In 1970, the median home price was $23,450. This means that if home prices grew at the same rate as inflation since 1970, the median home price today would be $177,788 rather than $429,100. 5. In 1980, the median home price was just $68,700, meaning that prices for housing has jumped by 262.44% since then. Housing costing $100,000 in the 80s would cost around $362,437 in 2022 for an equivalent purchase. 6. Compared to home prices in the 90s, today American adults spend on average 128.49% more on housing. Back then, the median price of a home was $123,000, which means today they have to spend $306,000 more for the same home. In other words, housing costing $200,000 in the year 1990 would cost roughly $456,981 in 2022 for an equivalent purchase. 7. On the other hand, the annual income increase has barely kept pace with inflation over the last few decades. Since 2000, the overall prices of goods have risen 67%. After adjusting for inflation, however, the median American household income has increased by just 7% in total since 2000. That's only 0.3% per year. 8. Car prices have also skyrocketed in the last 5 decades. The average cost of a new car in 1970 was just $3,450, while in 1980 Americans paid $7,200, and in 1990 they spent $16,950. In contrast, this year, if you want to buy a new car, you'll face an average price of an astounding $47,000. 9. At the same time, the cost of a gallon of gasoline has never been higher. Did you know that Americans used to pay only 36 cents for a gallon of gasoline in 1970? By 1980, they were already paying $1.19. In the early 90s, the average cost of a gallon of gas was $1.34, but nothing compared to the prices they've been seeing since the start of 2022. Right now, gasoline prices are hovering around the $5 mark. Experts say they will likely go higher as the country grapples with a shortage of fuels. 10. Food prices have soared too, and those at the very bottom of the economic food chain have been hit the hardest. Back in the 70s, an American could buy a loaf of bread for 25 cents. In the 80s, they were paying double, 50 cents. By the 90s, prices were already 70 cents. In 2022, we're paying 10 times more than our parents and grandparents were paying back then. A single loaf of simple white bread now costs about $2.50. 11. We're also seeing the highest rent prices ever recorded. Median rent prices shot up by 677% since 1970. During that time, the median monthly gross rent was only $108, a figure that, when adjusted for inflation, equals $734.21 today. Meanwhile, the actual national median rent is $1,827 a month, and that was recorded back in April, up 16.7% from a year ago. 12. American adults also have to pay more for a 4-year college degree and are left with higher student loan debt than previous generations. From the late 1980s to the 2020 school year, the cost of an undergraduate degree rose by 213% at public schools when adjusting for inflation. Back then, The average annual tuition for public college was just $1,490 or $3,190 in today's dollars, compared with today's price tag of $9,970. For private college tuitions, the increase was 129% when adjusted for inflation. In the late 1980s, it cost $7,050 or $15,160 in today's dollars for a private undergraduate degree. But today, the average cost is actually a staggering $34,740. 13. We're also spending a lot more money on entertainment right now than our parents and grandparents did in the past 5 decades. In 1976, it cost just $5.50 for a top box seat to watch the New York Yankees play, or about $24.27 in today's dollars. However, the same seat at a Yankees game in 2021 cost fans $375. On top of that, in 1970, the average price of a ticket to the Super Bowl was $91.52 adjusted for inflation. By 2014, it's already climbed up to an eye-popping $1,250. But in 2022, the 2022 Super Bowl ticket packages start at, get this, $3,272.50 per person. Depending on seat location and package details, listings even go up to an impressive $14,876 per person. 14. Having a child has always been expensive, but today it costs more than ever to raise your kids in the United States. Adjusting for inflation, the average weekly childcare costs increased to $216 in 2021 from $84 in 1985, and that's according to the U.S. Census Bureau. On top of that, childcare and pre-college education make up 18% of the total cost of raising a kid, compared with 2% in 1960, according to a Young Invincibles report. 15. You're probably going to spend around 50% more in healthcare than your parents and grandparents did back in the day. The average annual health insurance cost per person in 1970 was $146. In 2021, that number skyrocketed to $10,345, 9 times as high when adjusted for inflation. Costs are expected to hit $14,944 by next year, and because of uncertainty surrounding the future of the Affordable Care Act, some healthcare premiums are set to increase by an additional 50% by 2028. 16. Parents today are also paying more than double for electricity than they did back in the 1970s. Back then, the average electricity bill was $69.86. In 2019, that number jumped to $115, and this year the average monthly residential electric bill for Americans is $146.80, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. 17. This year, U.S. households will have to spend an extra $5,200, and that's about $433 a month, for the same consumption basket, according to a Bloomberg economics analysis. 18. A groundbreaking study published by the Rand Corporation found that the top 1% of American income earners have taken roughly $50 trillion from the bottom 90%. If the more equitable income distributions of the 3 decades following the year 1940 had merely held steady, the aggregate annual income of Americans earning below the 90th percentile would have been $2.5 trillion higher in the year 2020 alone. That is an amount equal to nearly 12% of GDP, enough to more than double median income. Enough to pay every single working American in the bottom 9 decades an additional $1,144 a month. Every month. Every single year. The institution calculates that the cumulative tab of 4 decades of rampant inequality amounted to $47 trillion from 1975 through 2018, crossing the $50 trillion mark by early 2020. That represents $50 trillion that would have gone into the paychecks of working Americans had inequality held constant, but instead wealth became more concentrated amongst the rich, while the 90% became dramatically poorer. 19. Even though the average wealth has steadily increased over the past 50 years, it has not grown equally for all groups. Between 1970 and 2020, the bottom 90% of the wealth distribution went from having no wealth, on average, to being about $1,000 in debt, while the top 10% saw their wealth increase 5-fold, and the wealth of the top 1% grew 7-fold. And 20. Last but not least, wealth inequality has also been a decisive fact for America's shrinking middle class. In 1970, families near the top 10% had 6 times the wealth, or $6 for every $1, of families in the middle class. By 2020, they had 12 times the wealth of middle-class families. Well, as you can see, America is in a giant mess right now, and we desperately need to get things turned around. We are deeply, deeply troubled as a society, as a nation, and as a declining economic superpower. America has fallen from greatness and needs to be restored. But we must act now, because the window to start making that change is closing very rapidly.